Hi, my name is Chrisy. I'm the Floodplain Officer at Rous County Council. My position in Council works in the flood mitigation section, and specifically my role is to look at reducing the environmental impact of our flood mitigation infrastructure. Today I'm going to talk to you guys about Blackwater, which is a water quality issue that we face quite regularly in the Richmond River estuary. So I just wanted to check, has anyone heard of Blackwater before? Maybe you might have heard it after floods associated with fish kills. Okay. So what I wanted to do was start from the beginning with the whole story of Blackwater, and essentially that's going back in time to before Europeans came to the North Coast region, really. So before white people were here, the coastal floodplains were unaltered, and they contained really large wetland systems, which we call back swamps. These huge systems would fill up with rainfall and fill up with floodwater, and they would be inundated with water for most of the years. And then when Europeans arrived in the North Coast, they looked at the floodplains and went, that's a really great place where we could potentially farm. However, it gets flooded a lot and the wetlands stay with water a lot. If we were going to farm these areas, what we'd have to do is we'd have to try and reduce the impacts of the floods, and we'd have to try and drain this land a bit because it's just far too wet for us to farm. And so associated with white people arriving on the floodplain was the floodplain being used for agriculture. Also, people wanted to live on the floodplain, and it really is a great place to farm because when you think about it, it's got some of the most fertile soils, productive soils. It's also relatively flat terrain. It's close to the waterway, so close for transports back in the olden days, close to the river and to shipping. It's also some of the best country when we have droughts and dry time, yeah? So it really is a great place to have agriculture, but they were repeatedly getting wiped out by floods. And so flood mitigation came in and said, okay, we can help with that, to help the communities, help the farmers, and we can help try and reduce the impact of flooding. One of the big things that we did down on that floodplain country was that we drained it. We drained it really well. So where there was massive historical wetlands on the floodplain, we came in and we significantly drained them. So instead of holding water for 9 to 12 months of the year, we essentially can get all the surface water off this country in less than 30 days now. So it completely altered the environment down there on the floodplain. When I talk about the floodplain, I've got a little map here. So to orientate yourself, we have Ballina up here on the river mouth, and Lisbore's up here on the Wilsons River. And so the coastal floodplain that we're referring to in terms of back swamps and in terms of floodplain drainage is anywhere really from Coraki down to Woodburn and then up to Ballina. And those largest low-lying swamp that I was talking about is in here in the Tuckian, down here at Rocky Mouth Creek, and then over here in the Sandy Creek Bungawalbin area. So we've highly modified that landscape for people to live in it and also for people to farm it by draining and doing flood mitigation. And in doing that, we've set around a series of changes to the environment that produces poor water quality from time to time, and Blackwater is one of them. So Blackwater is essentially when plants get inundated or flooded and they rot. And so, but what we see on the floodplain is that although we've changed those large back swamps to the point where we can farm them and, you know, get the surface water off in 30 days, they still flood. And so they still fill up with water. What drainage has done in those back swamps is a couple of things in terms of Blackwater. So what we've done is that because we've drained those swamp countries to the point where it's now can be used for dry land farming most of the year, we've changed the vegetation. So once upon a time, those back swamps would have looked, you know, more like this picture here. So wetland tolerant plant species, inundated for most of the year, and the plants in here are naturally resilient and okay with flooding because they're wetland species. But with drainage, we've changed that. So we're now growing like dry land pasture species in these back swamp areas. So what happens is that they fill up with water during our floods, and we've now changed the vegetation in those back swamps so they're now dry land pasture species. And when they fill up, particularly during the warmer months, all of that dry land pasture species rot en masse. And so you have these large reservoirs of water sitting out in these lowest lying areas where all the vegetation has rotted and died down, and it turns the water black, so pitch black. In that black water, you have very high levels of organic matter. And you can see this is a picture here of Blackwater discharging out of a floodgate into a waterway there. So can you see the difference between the Blackwater and the brown river water mixing? So the drains not only change the vegetation type, so now we have a vegetation growing in there that's really intolerant of flooding and that rots really easy, but then the drains actually get that black water off and into the river really quickly. So the drains have two roles in terms of blackwater events on the floodplain. They create the vegetation that's really intolerant of flooding, but the drains then also transport that bad water really quickly out into the estuary. They also transport that water out into the estuary when the estuary can, at the very least, handle it. So the river has just finished a flood. The estuary doesn't have any assimilation capacity. It can't buffer this water out. So this black water comes out, and what it does is that the amount of organic matter that's sitting in there from the rotting pastures, it essentially gobbles up all of the dissolved oxygen that is in its way. So when it discharges into these natural creeks, it starts to plummet the dissolved oxygen levels within the actual creeks and the waterways. And that's when we have large fish kill events. So the largest fish kill events in the Richmond have been the 2001 and the 2008 floods. So this is the West Ballina Key Estate in the 2008 fish kill. This is really quite typical of what we see when we have the most significant blackwater events, when the entire estuary becomes depleted of oxygen. So to give you an idea of oxygen levels, so for a healthy waterway, you're looking at 7 to 8 milligrams per litre. Anything under 4 is critical, and anything under 2 is lethal. And so in the 2001 and 2008 Blackwater events, we had dissolved oxygen levels in the main river channel of 0. When you have that, everything dies. It's not just the big fish that you can see washing up on the shore, but it's benthic creatures, it's prawns, it's mud crabs, it's things that can actually get up and walk out of the water. So it is a complete decimation of the aquatic life that's in there. So for Rous County Council, this is a really big issue because we have historical management responsibility for the majority of main drainage systems that create the issue and discharge it into the estuary. And so for us, it's really a process of working with the landowners and working with the scientists to make sure that we have the latest scientific understanding of those, and then trying to raise awareness of how difficult it is to try and fix this situation. So those large back swamps that have been drained and used for agriculture, they're all zoned rural agricultural land use. So the landowners are allowed to use them for agriculture, and historically they always have been. And then there's no legislative reason or legislative push to change the drainage in those areas as well. So what we're really looking at is trying to raise awareness of the issue and having a conversation in the community and saying, okay, so in 2021, when we have these large back swamp areas, and some of them are very low, so we're talking about 50 centimetres above average sea level and below. So if we have country that's sitting 50 centimetres or below average sea level, should we be farming that now? Should we be farming that? Is that sustainable and long term when we start looking at sea level rise, when we start looking about what we know about water quality issues associated with that lowest lying country? And as a community, if the answer is no, we don't think we should be farming that country anymore, then what is the solution for the landowners that are currently owning that land and historically been able to use it for agriculture, remembering that legally they're not doing anything wrong. These are historical land use practices that have been in place for up to over 100 years. So it's about looking at that situation now with fresh eyes and saying, okay, in 2021, what do we do? Yeah. At that point, I was wondering, does anyone have any questions from what I've mentioned so far? Yep.
Yeah, I wanted to know how many days does it take before the plants rot?
Yeah, okay. So there's a couple of drivers for that, and we have this neat curve that has been done by the scientists. So it depends on a couple of factors. The biggest control of this is temperature and depth of inundation. So on average, before the Blackwater starts to create is 6 to 10 days. but it really just depends on how deep the floodplain has been inundated and how hot the ambient temperature is. Worst case scenario is that you have a major summer flood in summer and you have average air temperatures of 27 degrees and above. That's the worst case scenario for producing Blackwater. Yeah.
Like 3 days, or if you just like getting shorter, or is it still about 6 days?
Yeah, so it's still really about that 6 to 10 days. What's interesting is that you really just can't even, because we often get the comment, well, can't we just try and get the water off quicker? Wouldn't that be the solution? But the system, the river and the estuary is in such a flooded state at that point, you just simply can't get the water off. So even if you actually got pumps and tried to pump it, the volume that's sitting out there versus the space that's in the estuary, it's just a futile exercise. And these low-lying back swamp country, they are generally the last place to actually drain away anyway, because you need the river level to drop before they'll start to discharge. So it really is quite a tricky situation with that lowest lying country. Do you have a question here?
I've got a few questions.
Yep.
I guess one, how does acid sulfate soil
Yep.
relate to this? Is that a separate topic, or is this part of that same process?
So it's a separate topic, but what's interesting is that it is caused by essentially the same issue. So floodplain drainage of the lowest lying country. So acid sulfate soils are a naturally occurring soil type in the estuaries that has a high sulfuric soil content. When it's oxidized with air, it produces sulfuric acid and iron, aluminium, very low pH. And again, the floodplain drainage is what creates the problem, but also what transports it into the estuary. So it's a very similar function to how it occurs and the issue with it getting into the estuary, but a different biological and chemical process.
So Blackwater is natural, but it's exacerbated by...
That's a really good question. Yeah, so we often get that, but Blackwater's a natural thing, so why should we be worried about it? Blackwater is a natural process that occurs in estuaries and rivers and floodplains all over the place. You get Blackwater events in the Murray-Darling Basin as well. But on our coastal floodplains here, what's happened is that the degree of floodplain drainage that we've done on the lowest lying land has exacerbated that untold amount. So yeah, instead of these areas being flooded for 9 to 12 months, we get all the surface water off in 30 days. And so not only do we create the change in vegetation that makes the Blackwater there, but then we also have these really great clear paths for it to discharge straight into the estuary. So yeah, drainage is the key. Is there another question? Yeah.
One more question. As to what makes it so black? What actually is it? Is it bacteria?
So it's a breakdown of the plants and the releasing of tannins. So if anyone's been to Lake Ainsworth, yeah, and you got that Coca-Cola type tannin stained, so that's very similar. It's the amount of organic matter and tannin that is sitting in the water that gives it that very dark colour. Yeah, it also smells as well. It's got a very strong smell. So if you're ever down on the floodplain after a summer flood, you can almost smell it happening. Yeah, yeah. Jimmy, did you have a question?
Yeah, just because I've been told by some of the people in the area that I live in, Blackwater,
Yep.
that the creek used to run clean.
Yep.
Is there going to be a process where we can see clean river systems again in Australia?
It'd be great. And I think really it comes back to the point that I made before, is that it's up to us as a community to decide how we want to use floodplains, how we want to use the lowest lying floodplain areas, understanding that traditionally they were back swamp areas, and understanding that they also are the source of the major water quality problems that we have on the floodplain and in the estuary. It's really up to us as a community to decide, like, do we want this land used for agriculture? And if the answer is yes, then we continue. If the answer is no, then as a community we need to think about how do we transition that land from what it is now to reverting it back potentially to a wetland. It's not. It's a long-term solution as well. There's not a lot that we can do in the interim that will also make it better as well, just from the scale of major flood events. So we have done things in the past where we've looked at reducing drainage density and trying to move to a more wetland, wet pasture species type of an agricultural system. But unfortunately, when you have like a major summer flood event, that it all just fills up, and it really just, if you've got pasture species in there that are intolerant of flooding, then they'll just rot. Yeah, so it doesn't, even if you have wet pasture systems there, if you get a big enough flood in summer, they'll rot as well. Yeah.
Is
Yep.
there anything that people can do in the upper catchment that would alleviate that pressure, or is it all really lowlands? It's already there.
Yeah, it's essentially a function of the lowland that's there, but it is interesting, I think, this idea of understanding that the upper catchment and the lower catchment are linked, intrinsically linked, and so what we do in the upper catchment does affect the lower catchment. So we have water quality issues coming out from the floodplain with Blackwater and acidity. We also have the water when it gets to the floodplain in a flood event is already compromised from increased sedimentation from upstream. So you find that dissolved oxygen will already be at around 4 when it gets to Korakai before any back swamps discharge into it. So that's one thing that we can improve the water quality getting down to the floodplain. The other thing that I think is interesting is this idea of natural flood mitigation in the upper catchment, trying to slow the water down in the upper catchment. It's something that we definitely see on the floodplain a lot, is that the river is increasingly, I think, being used and being seen as a very large stormwater system. So we are trying to shed water off land right from the top of the catchment all the way down. And so we're just trying to shed water off towns and farms and roads and shed it all off as quickly as we can. And generally it all ends up into the river. So that idea of increased upper catchment flows coming down to the floodplain is something that could help.
Behind Eugene.